Hello everyone. So the topic today we are dealing in this session is EU actorness in South Asia. Uh, Let me walk you briefly the context why we're discussing this topic. Uh, After today's session, it's very much clear what is the geostrategic importance of Indo-Pacific. So that's the background in which we are discussing South Asia and EU actorness in the region. So Indo-Pacific, as you all know, that it has emerged as a center of gravity in terms of your trade, in terms of your economic interaction, in terms of your demographics and security challenge as well. So the reason being, the maritime routes, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, they provide the sea lane for majority of the world trade today. So there is also an intense competition underway among various powers in the region. So as the Indo-Pacific's strategic importance, it increases, countries around the world are developing new policies, are developing new strategies to strengthen their reach, their foothold within the region. We already know that US is very much there, EU has its own strategy, Russia is very much part of the region, China is all over the place. So in that background, South Asia becomes a very important region, and its importance we cannot overstate here. So the future of the region, future of South Asia, it becomes very important for the world for geopolitical as well as geo-economic reasons. Now, we take South Asia as SAARC members, 8 countries. Sometimes we do include Myanmar as well, but let's say 8 countries. Even these 8 countries of SAARC nation, SAARC organization, they constitute around roughly around 25% of the world population. So that's the demography we are talking about, and total volume of their GDP. It amounts to almost US dollar 3.53 trillion, and the average growth rate has been about 5% in the recent year. So what kind of regional interface EU have with such an important region? Now we know that EU has almost good and solid relations with almost all the 8 countries of the region. It has very great trade and aid relations. Now, in the recent years, it has also developed close, and it has expanding its partnership with India, and that can also be seen as EU's greater attention towards the region. One more thing is that EU's relation with the region, they are largely, it has adopted largely a bilateral approach. When it comes to South Asia, the region itself, it is largely mentioned in the broader framework of EU strategy when it comes to connecting Europe and Asia, or global strategy of Europe in Asia. So South Asia becomes part of those documents. Specifically focused on South Asia, a comprehensive strategy which defines EU's engagement with the region. It exists in relation to other regions like ASEAN or Africa. It has not yet formulated such a strategy. However, the things are slowly moving, forward. The increasing importance of India, the way we can see that we have moved away from our previously we have narrowly defined relations with South Asia in terms of largely aid and trade. Now we are slowly moving away from that. Also, as the traditional and non-traditional security threats rise, South Asia as a region, it will need much more attention and engagement with the wider world. So in that background, EU's policy and EU's presence, its actorness, its engagement with the region becomes very, very important. In any case, the way South Asia sees itself is also evolving. Instead of viewing itself as a bounded region in terms of in geopolitical terms, which now has a very diminishing utility, South Asia now sees itself both in terms of a region we see South Asia both in terms of its, the overall region and its constituent elements who are reaching out to the wider world, creating interlinkages with the wider world. So in that context, again, the EU, with its vast, capabilities, its technical resources, its know-how, its skills, its experience of institutional building, it becomes very, very important for South Asia. So there is this concept which the title of this session has, EU Actorness in South Asia. I just want you to briefly walk you through what exactly is this actorness, from where this concept has emerged. So the role of EU in international relation itself, it is a subject of controversy. Why is that? Because the way traditional international relations scholars, the way they approach foreign policy and the relations between states, what they do is they take a very state-centric approach to analyze foreign relations. So in that context, EU it's not a state; it's a supranational body, right? So when it came on the global platform, it presented these traditional IR scholars with a very theoretical puzzle and a challenge. So these scholars, these traditional IR scholars, they struggle somewhere to define the EU as an international actor. Particularly here, I'm talking about the mainstream IR theorists, realism, liberalism. They were struggling a lot how to define EU as an international actor. So the debate constituted around whether non-state actors may be regarded as actors in the international relations, right? Because these traditional IR scholars, they privilege the state as the only actor on the anarchical international arena, right? And how they view the international arena as anarchical and in terms of zero-sum game, a self-help system where each state's main obligation and interest is to secure its own survival in competition with the other states. So in such a system, the way they define, the way they view, the way they perceive the world, the potential for trust and cooperation between actors is very low, and EU was doing exactly opposite to what these theorists were proclaiming. So in that background, the concept of actorness first emerged in the late 1970s. And the earliest definition which we have from 1977, which you can see on your screen, it defined this whole concept, this whole notion of actorness, as the actor capability, in terms of actor capability. And it defined it as a measure of autonomous units' capacity to behave actively and deliberately in relation to other actors in the international system. So that was the initial definition of actorness we had in the late 1970s that it emerged. So what happened a few years down the line as the bloc itself progressed in post especially Maastricht Treaty 93, which became the basis for developing EU's common foreign and security policy. There came an academic breakthrough once again into this whole concept of actorness research. So the search for explanation, it became more urgent. There was a need to understand EU's performance, or sometimes the lack of it. There was a need to understand that, and that brought actorness, this concept of actorness, once again at the forefront throughout your 1990s. So there are two major works which are cited when it comes to this whole notion of actorness. One is by Juppel and Caporoso, and another one was by Vogler and Brethren. So what he has done is for Juppel and Caporoso, he actually he gives 4 dimensions to measure actorness. Right, one is your cohesion, which basically means the degree to which this particular, any particular group is able to formulate and articulate, internally consistent policy preferences. The second they're saying is that another dimension to measure activeness is the authority, where the entities, joint activities, they have some sort of legal sanction, right? Third is autonomy, whether the entity has a distinctive identity and interest that are not only independent of the other actors, but also its most prominent constituent members. And lastly, how they included in this dimension of activeness was recognition, where other actors, other states, other players within the international arena, they recognize, they accept, and they interact with the entity. On the other most often cited work within this field was Bretheton and Vogler. They have, over a period of time, they have refined this concept, they have elaborated this concept. Firstly, they wrote back in 1996, again they revised in 2006, 2008. So they actually expanded the list of criteria for activeness. They came up with other three major dimensions. One, they say, is opportunity, which basically denotes the factor in the external environment of the actors under consideration. It's external environment, how it influences its decision making. Then second is presence. Here they specifically talk about, it was in relation to EU. So they say EU's ability to exert influence beyond its borders. That dimension, the presence part. And then the third is capability. It basically refers to the internal context of EU. Now, in this particular concept, one major issue is the question of effectiveness. How effective are certain policies which this particular entity has taken up? There has always been some capability and expectation gap. What we mean here is there are certain declared objectives, but the actual results, which the end result of those declared policies, declared objectives, they sometimes do not match with what was initially proclaimed. So there is this capability expectation gap. So how effective are the policies of this particular actor at international stage? We look activeness through that prism as well. So when it comes to EU's activeness in South Asia, how do we assess? How do I like to assess that here is through its normative power. Now, EU promotes its core values of peace, its liberty, democracy, its rule of law, and respect for human rights in its foreign policy, its security policy, its defense policy, and it thereby presents somewhere, it presents itself as a model for others to follow. Now, EU's norm-oriented presence in the international arena, it qualifies its activeness as a normative power. Now, one important thing we have to keep in mind here is, the extent of this. When we especially look at it from South Asia perspective, we have to understand that the extent of this EU's norm diffusion to South Asia, somewhere it also depends, the extent of localization. Now, this prospect of localization, again, it has two main factors. First is, who are the key norm setters, who are the key norm takers, how credibly they have framed these norms. And also important is to look at the strength of the prior local norms which are present in the region. Right, so the ability of framing these norms, the language in which these norms are framed, the policies, the way EU has framed these policies. So the ability of framing, that becomes the critical factor when it comes to this nexus between external norms and how they are localized, right? And they are adjusted locally. So the extent extent to which local agents, local actors, they localize or they imbibe these foreign norms, it also depends on how external actors, how they present their norms. So a lot depend on this capability of framing, this idea of delivery. So to understand EU activeness, in South Asia, what I would say is that it is necessary to understand how external actor or EU frame the norms that they seek to propagate. Now, what I have done is to present to understand this whole normative power of Europe through its democracy promotion in South Asia. Now, democracy promotion, it is one of the core ideas in European foreign policy. It has been incorporated into various agreements with third countries since the early 90s. Now, to understand this, we have, why it is so, to understand that, we have to understand what is this historical nexus, this linkage between democracy and EU foreign policy. Now, this linkage somewhere is related to the conditions under which the European community itself was established. During the Cold War, as you all know, that there was a need for the Europeans to cooperate, to come together against the communist threat. The world was divided into two blocks. So, as a result of ideological rivalry at that time, EC membership was not open to all. Right, but it was only open to those that were democratic, that had freely elected parliament. So at that time, the provision excluded the communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. So this foreign policy cooperation, it was from the very beginning, it was linked with this broad objective of community building, right, and which was underpinned by a very specific normative commitment, which is the consolidation of democracy and expansion of liberal representative democracy in Europe. That was the idea. So with the end of Cold War, and the increasing significance of human rights issues, 1992 Maastricht Treaty, it elevated the whole idea of democracy promotion, rule of law, human rights. It became somewhere the primary objectives of European Union's foreign policy. Now, we also know that EU links its development policy, its development aid also with its foreign policy by stipulating that development cooperation. It says that development cooperation shall contribute to the general objectives of developing and consolidating democracy. So development policy is directly related to this promotion of democracy, promotion of rule of law, respecting human rights, fundamental freedoms. That's one of the major tools that EU uses in non-EU countries. So another very important part, how it promotes democracy in non-EU countries, is that various cooperation agreements that it has signed with these countries, they introduce human rights, they introduce democracy clauses, and in these cooperation agreements there is something called essential clauses which talks about this democracy and human rights promotion. So it has used that as well. So in another important thing which it has done over a period of time is that it adopted something called European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights, which was eventually replaced by European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. It had a very people-centered approach, very comprehensive strategy, again, to integrate this democracy promotion, this human rights into the EU's external policies. In 2021, if we think that in recent years we have not seen much about EU promoting democracy, it is more concerned with security policy, it's more concerned with its own stability. But in 2021, what we have seen is there is a new program which it adopted. It launched this something called Global Europe Human Rights and Democracy Program, and with The budget for this program, which what it has allotted, is euro 1.5 billion dollars. So the idea is again to step up, EU support in promoting democracy, rule of law, human rights, support to civil society, defend human rights, support human rights defenders across the globe. So that's another new development in EU's foreign policy. Now, EU's, I kind of I told you about like what instrument it has in place for democracy promotion in non-EU countries, in third countries. One again is it's traditional diplomatic and foreign policy instruments. It basically includes, declaration, marches, and UN fora, its cooperation and assistance program, its bilateral political dialogues, and sanctions. Although it never had, at least with third countries, very punitive approach, it has not adopted. But yeah, these are the instruments in place. Then second is this essential element clause in cooperation agreement, which I already spoke about. Then through political dialogues in human rights and democratization, that's another way in which it promotes its norms and its values. It also helps the third countries in election assistance, and it sends election observation missions to these countries. It widely supports civil society in these countries. And I also spoke about this European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights, which in 2021 was replaced by this Global Human Rights and Democracy Program. And development assistance, the way it funds its aid and development program, that also becomes a tool of democracy promotion, human rights, rule of law. It's basically its norm, how it transmits its norm through these various instruments to non-EU countries. So what has happened over a period of time, what we are looking at is EU's actorness, it's EU's how prevalent it's, how successful it is or effective it is when it comes to transferring or transmitting its norm to South Asia. Through that lens, through that prism, we are trying to understand its actorness in South Asia. So when it comes to India, what has happened is both India and EU over a period of time, through various agreements, through various meetings, they have reiterated this shared values of we have shared values of democracy, we have shared values of pluralism. That has been they have been saying that in various agreements right from the 1990s. Your second India EU summit, which happened back in 2001. There, both the side, they resolved that they will, together step up efforts to promote democracy and human rights. Then again, later on in various summits, they said the same thing. But on paper, what we see is that they have reiterated these shared values of democracy and pluralism, but there is very little coordination on these goals on ground. No concrete, effort has been there, and that somewhere relates to they have very different approaches with regard to democracy promotion. India is somewhere on the defensive side of it, EU is somewhere on the offensive side of it, right? Also today what we see is how it has changed over a period of time. Is initially in the 90s we used to hear a lot more about Kashmir issue statements, human rights. But today what we see is that stance has completely shifted, and that somewhere we could relate it to the economic rise of India. So today what we find is EU is somewhere very reluctant to approach this sensitive issue of Kashmir. Again, in January 2020, on India's citizenship law and other protests which were happening within the country, there was something EU Parliament wanted to adopt a resolution condemning these discriminatory citizenship law, but it indefinitely postponed it because of external pressure. Then there was a recommendation it adopted after farmers' protests in India, and very recently we have resumed our human rights dialogue, with EU, which had been previously suspended for quite a few years. So that is overall, EU's approach towards democracy promotion in India. We see a very real politic view, as and when our strength as an economic powerhouse, we become an economic powerhouse, the criticism from EU or the way it approaches us on certain issues, it changes. And the similar thing we see in Pakistan as well. The policy in Pakistan, it is again, it's torn between your real politic view and your value-based approach. It was a very confusing policy to the point that we adopted it when it comes to democracy promotion in Pakistan. So back in 1999, when Musharraf came to power, you cancelled all the political annual dialogues. Various conditions were imposed. They wanted to see some tangible progress towards this restoration of representative democracy in Pakistan at that time. So they reduced the aid, they suspended new projects. So that was a very hard approach they adopted when that military coup happened in the 1999. But few years down the line, what we experienced is, after 9/11 happened by 2001. So Pakistan's role as an important ally, it became very important for war on terrorism. It was supporting US in Afghanistan. So it became an ally. It was always a strong Western ally, but at that time, its importance as a geostrategic actor, it rose to prominence. So in that background, EU responded very differently to Pakistan and the whole idea of value-based approaches, democracy promotion. So it ended up, signing, trade and cooperation agreement just within a gap of 2-3 years. 1999, it's criticizing Musharraf, it's criticizing Pakistan in 2001 after 9/11 and Afghanistan and everything. So it is signing trade and cooperation agreement. It granted, zero tariff to Pakistan's textile, adopted 5-year cooperation agreement with Pakistan. Again, in 2007, when Musharraf imposed emergency, you just raised a concern, serious concern, but there were no sanctions, there were no major, there's nothing concrete that it did. So what was happening at that time, what it was saying that there is no alternative factor. That was the policy approach that it took to Pakistan, towards Pakistan at that particular time. There is no alternative but to deal with Pakistan the way it is. So beyond that, it has sent various election observation missions in Pakistan. It has sent various development assistance. Today also you have very serious concerns about human rights situation, especially blasphemy laws in Pakistan. And in 2021, Parliament again raised very serious concerns over human rights violation, growing religious intolerance, and shrinking freedom of expression when it comes to Pakistan. So it's GSP plus status, which provides various benefits, concessions when it comes to trade. So that is attached with certain human rights and democracy clauses, and it's going to come up for review next year. So that is one major development that is happening over there. That it looks like that that whole idea, this whole agenda of democracy, which was there back in 90s and 2000, it's again somewhere it might haunt us once again. With the world is getting divided between democracies and non-democracies, and this idea of democracy promotion, it might gain center stage within the EU foreign policy in the coming years. The next is Nepal. Here again, you played a very proactive role in restoration of parliamentary democracy. It funded major governance-related project. It gave funding for the consolidation of democracy. It helped in improving the judicial system through various conflict mitigation packages. when the royal takeover happened in 2005, it suspended all the programs, and the launch of new projects. It was completely put on hold at that time. But after that, as and when the country has moved away and progressed and tried and resolved its conflict, EU has always been present in some form or the other election observation missions. It has sent major funding between 2014 and 2020 period. Today, also the priority areas for EU in Pakistan are related to rural development, education, strengthening democracy, decentralization, and good governance. That's one of the major focus of EU in Nepal. In Bangladesh, also, what has happened, again, there also good governance became a very, very major issue for EU to cooperate with authorities in Bangladesh. It became a very major supporter. It gave a huge financial support for the voters registration drive throughout from 2008 onwards. It still supports the strengthening of the electoral institution, especially the election commission in Bangladesh. It also actively supported the implementation of peace accords with in the Chittagong Hill tracts. There, it is very much an active player when it comes to development of village polls, implementation of census, and overall effort of Bangladesh to move towards good governance. It has been very much part of that. And the funding, it almost committed up to euro 690 million under the 2014 and 2020 multi-annual indicative program to Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, that's a very interesting story. Sri Lanka is once again a very interesting story. The way EU has its role in Sri Lanka. When it comes to relief and rehabilitation packages, it has always been a major partner of Sri Lanka. It has always provided this relief and rehabilitation assistance since way back in 1983 when the conflict first started over there. And early 2000s, it was very, very much engaged in expanding the peace process. It was one of the major partners. Its policy towards Sri Lanka has always focused on conflict resolution, reconstruction, development through trade, good governance, human rights, humanitarian assistance, social sector programs. That was on the agenda. And interestingly, EU was more open. It was seen as more open when it came to engagement with LTTE at that particular point of time. It also sent various election observation missions to Sri Lanka. But 2005, after the bombing and the death of Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka by LTTE, at that time, EU for the first time issued travel ban on LTTE members and also banned the group activities, its fund collection and propaganda campaigns. So at that time, ban on LTTE, it was widely seen by EU. It was widely seen within the policy circles and academic community. That this particular ban by EU, it encouraged Colombo to adopt a more militaristic approach to the ethnic question there. EU at that time, it shifted from being the good cop to the bad cop, and its approach was criticized a lot for discrediting the peace and reconciliation efforts. And when it comes to conflict resolution in Sri Lanka, its impact was kind of limited, mainly because its influence was overshadowed by other important players like India and China. Secondly, then it kind of missed a lot of opportunities to the political trends, developing political trends. It was late in responding to the political trends and opportunities emerging in Sri Lanka. And also the rise of anti-Western policies and the undermining of democracies, which we see in late in 2000s. That became one of the major reasons. And its policy, its response itself among the EU member states was not well coordinated when it comes to Sri Lanka. At one hand, The Parliament was talking about, banning export of arms and everything to Sri Lanka, but there were a lot of, there were few member states which were still exporting arms to Sri Lanka. So that coordinated response within the EU itself, when it comes to Sri Lanka, it was lacking, and that together became, the reason for its ineffectiveness when it comes to conflict in Sri Lanka. It also tried to hit very hard when it comes to democracy and human rights in Sri Lanka, in various major forums like UN. After 2010, it also suspended its GSP plus status to Sri Lanka, and it recently, in 2017, it granted access again for its export under this particular clause. Now, the criteria for GSP plus, again, as I had mentioned previously, is directly linked to the clauses on human rights, good governance, and democracy. So the political reforms and compliance with international conventions on human rights, on labor rights, environmental protection, good governance, all those are part of the criteria for GSP plus. And the European Parliament, again, it's very closely, it's monitoring the progress in complying, whether Sri Lankan authorities are complying effectively with this criteria or not. The continuation is again dependent on, it's conditional on the compliance of these criteria, which EU holds very, very dear. Now, here are the two major concerns which EU has raised is the issue of transitional justice and the national reconciliation. Again, for Pakistan it's coming up for review in 2022, and for Sri Lanka also it's the criteria, that's its whole GSP plus criteria, it's coming for review in 2022. So that's about Sri Lanka. Here, the way we have seen South Asia, what I would like to point out here is that, first of all, what is EU Actorness? EU Actorness, somewhere, its international presence, it relies on its international presence, how it influences the actions and expectations of other actors. So its actorness completely depends on that. Secondly, its presence, again, how do we judge, how do we gauge, how do we measure EU's presence is through these norms, through these values which EU holds very dear, and which it continuously tries to transfer to other countries. These are, again, principle of liberty, democracy, human rights, fundamental freedom, rule of law. So that determines EU's presence in any region, especially when it comes to South Asia. So the backbone of EU's relation with South Asia has always been aid and trade. That is there, but both these aid and trade are also very much linked to these values and these norms that are very integral part of EU's foreign policy. Now, again, upholding the universality and indivisibility of these principles, it became a key objective for EU foreign policy, and again, it becomes the hallmark of EU's normative power. That's what is EU's normative power. So now these ideological underpinnings, these whole idea of transferring norms to other countries, making it part of development aid, making it part of cooperation agreement, bringing it up through various political dialogues. These are also widely criticized, not only because somewhere they imply a form of cultural hegemony. Yesterday also we were talking about this superiority legacy, which Mr. Rinaldi, when he spoke in our inaugural address, he spoke about the superiority legacy which EU has. So these ideological underpinnings, they have been criticized because somewhere they imply this form of cultural hegemony. That's one thing. And secondly, what we have seen is throughout years, and the examples which I took, let's say Pakistan, let's say Sri Lanka, how different are those? Sri Lanka is hitting very hard, and in Pakistan again it's the real politics, it's the realist world, realist worldview which it subscribes to when it comes to Pakistan, because again Pakistan becomes very important for its war on terrorism, its important ally in Afghanistan and everything. So there it kind of it moderates its policy of democracy promotion. So the idea is EU has somewhere been unable to effectively implement its normative agenda within the region because of its own compulsions, because of its own self-interest. So that hypocritical stance, if I can call it, it's a little harsh word to use, but that has come out very clearly when it comes to EU's norm setting and norm promotion in South Asia. So overall, in my view, the EU's actorness and its normative power in South Asia, it remains very marginal. Its actorness, it's quite high when it comes to trade and aid and development assistance. But when we look at it through the prism of its norm setting power, especially in terms of democracy promotion, in terms of human rights, rule of law, all those things, fundamental freedoms, there it's somewhere it is a very marginal play. It's almost kind of non-existent. So let me stop here, but here I would also of course we have enough time. I would love to take questions, but just to understand your views, I want to understand that why this whole norm setting capacity of EU in South Asia, why it has been so low. One reason which I told you is cultural hegemony, this idea of superiority, legacy superiority, and everything. That is one major factor which I, as a scholar, as a researcher, I can figure out. Second, which I think is its policies are not coherent. So this whole the way it is transferring its values in these countries, it has different approach in different countries. Like Sri Lanka, it's different. It's Bangladesh, it's kind of different. Pakistan is completely different. Like today, when it looks at India, human rights and democracy is not even on the agenda. So this whole idea of EU and this idea of democracy, human rights, are integral to EU's and its functioning. That's somewhere it becomes it is kind of questioned when it comes to South Asia. So also EU does not have a coherent regional policy approach when it comes to South Asia as compared to ASEAN, as compared to Africa. It's more dependent on this bilateral relations with these individual countries. So what it says, what comes out here is that South Asia itself is so fragmented, it is so divided. We cannot form a coherent policy. We cannot have a regional approach because of the internal division, because of the internal fragmentation. SARC is completely non-functional here. So there is no organization with which we can deal with. So what they say is that's why we take up this bilateral approach. What else you can think of when it comes to this lack of EU's norm setting power in South Asia specifically? Hitesh.
Thank you, and thank you for really elaborate, discussion, presentation what you just gave about you. And there are a few points I want note since it has a connection from the very first part of the session. I'd start from there where when we were talking about the relevance of Indo-Pacific. I think the existence of Indo-Pacific can only be relevant to Asia, specifically to South Asia, when there is when the negotiation, diplomacy which take place in that is led by the Asians, by the South Asians, and not by the West. And this is something what I guess and since there is as per Metcalfe, the inference is that the Indo-Pacific will not amount to much, because the key countries, really do not have a precise meaning of what Indo-Pacific means in this whole bilateral relations. So I guess it would end up by being, something which is led by the West only, because no one at least from the Asian countries, would have a precise understanding of what this Indo-Pacific means. Every country is just thinking of their own idea of Indo-Pacific, and there is no consensus to that. Coming to the second part of it, which we come in this presentation, what I believe, there is a lack of hermeneutic understanding of international words like democracy, authoritarianism, communism, and various other ideas what we talk about, the philosophy we talk about. There is a lack of hermeneutic understanding in international relations, in realist theories, and specifically from the European Union as well. To give you an example of this, it also, before I give an example, it also brings us this whole idea where European Union is still come under the idea of realism, that is raison d'etat. And when I say that, I have a reason to say that, where this whole Maastricht Treaty has bring the idea of one common European identity. Since then, it has become a project for European Union to make a common European identity. And as they say in anthropology, l'identité, l'état, identité. That means identity is a state, and state is the identity. So it brings us the question, how exactly European Union works as a common state in such kind of policies. Moreover, coming to the normative power, this whole idea of multiculturalism, I can give you an this is a paradox which European Union create in South Asian countries, or overall in the third world countries. To give you an example, the whole idea of multiculturalism, which a lot of intellectuals take when they talk about this whole idea of multiculturalism, creates a paradox. For example, the caste discourse in India, the way caste has been culturalized in India, and has been considered as a multicultural identity of India, and ethnicized as an ethnic identity of Indians, which is again understood from the Western perspective of understanding caste, and they do not understand it as a perspective of how exactly it has come into the existence at the very first place. Also, the paradox is, it is important as well to have these kind of this paradox of multiculturalism, because there have been rising ultra-nationalist genocidal forces in India who do not want particular religion to sustain in India. So therefore, we really need that as well. So this is something what we can, we as policy makers or thinkers, we really need to ponder upon these points, where these ideas are a lot more nuanced than we actually put it in when we think of mind. It's not just a simple black and white or binary, that is the 0 and 1. There is a lot more nuances in these, and we need to understand it from a hermeneutic perspective. So yeah.
Very, very interesting points you raised. Initially, when you said, like, with your first point, your relevance of the idea of Indo-Pacific, you are saying that that's very correct when you say, somewhere South Asian countries have to come at the forefront when it comes to defining this geographical construct of Indo-Pacific, and except India, we do not see any other major part played by any of the countries. But I may not agree here when you say that this whole project is completely led by West. Actually, this whole Indo-Pacific construct, the way it emerged, it's very much I would say it's the lead was taken by Japan. It's the outcome of a regional approach, and the US and the West, it kind of joined us. I agree that there is no uniform linear conceptual clarity. We don't have that on the Pacific. Each country it views the whole region through the prism of its own self-interest. But the idea that it's a Western-led project, that may not be true. So it somewhere arises out of our own needs, our own security challenges, and for once, it is the US who has joined Asians in this whole project. So they came later. We initiated it. Is my understanding of this. And again, on when you talk about this whole idea of multiculturalism, your caste question and everything, I agree. Somewhere there is a lack of understanding, even when we look at EU and its policies in South Asia, the way it has approached this whole question of its norms and the way its policies have been shaped. Somewhere we realize that it failed to understand the local context in which these countries function, the historical background, the social structure of these countries. So there is somewhere we both do not understand each other. That's why those perception and misperceptions are very much part of the dynamic between Europe and Asia here. So yeah, the lack of local context, understanding of local context, it becomes a very important part of the dynamic. Yes.
Sorry, just the point that Hitesh raised, how this entire thing is being led by the West. I think I'll partially agree with Hitesh on this, because if you see, even just take the case of Indo-Pacific, for example, yes, Japan was one of the first countries for sure, and you contextualized it in the regional sense. But if you see in the broader way, why this entire debate has taken center stage is because of United States of America, because of the West. It's because because obviously one of the reasons was they felt a threat to their own hegemonic position. The entire, the investment, the kind of attention that Indo-Pacific is receiving today is because it's one sense, if you see, it's the propaganda of the West. In that sense, I would say it's in that lens as well. It has been, US is taking the revival of Quad also, if you see. America had a very important role to play. Of course, it brought together Asian and Australian partners. That's a different thing altogether. But again, Quad was also able to revive itself was because, in one sense, America felt the threat. There was a threat that was felt. And it was in one way to secure its own position that you see the entire debate over the Indo-Pacific. Of course, the entire West also was very late. Paradigm China had already made inroads. And it's surprising that, honestly, India should have also been in the forefront, responding to what China was doing, because China is our immediate neighbor.
Yeah, that's what we actually discussed in the morning session as well. When you say the project came at the forefront because of US lead, I agree at that part. But the way it was conceptualized, the way it started itself way back in 2006 and 7, I think it emerged out of Asian insecurities and what we as a region were facing at that time. It took almost a decade to reach where it has reached, and despite US indifference towards it for a very long time, it kind of sustained. The idea itself, it sustained. So I'm as an Indian, as an Indian scholar, I somewhere I feel uncomfortable, giving this. This whole credit to the whole idea of Indo-Pacific to the Western nation that they came up with it, and yeah, of course their investment, their involvement, it brought the concept at a very different stage, at a very different level, but the conceptualization part, it was very much led by Japan, by India, by Australia, is what I would say. And why India could not do anything about it, the material capabilities, and Dr. Pant today spoke so much about the miscalculation of Indian policymakers and Indian decision makers, and we somewhere still struggles with that. I don't want to say it, but even the current government somewhere when the Doklam issue happens, the very word China, it doesn't come out very actively, or it doesn't. We don't see it very much. Somewhere we are playing it safe. We are still playing it safe, despite at the very forefront of this whole insecurity dynamic which is playing out in the Pacific. Yeah, Gaurav.
Ma'am, while we're discussing this whole issue of the emergence of Indo-Pacific as a concept, as a perception, and how it began in 2007-8 and during that period, how do you see the political will of the countries of Asia, particularly South Asia, in kind of this narrative not growing as much as it could have or should have during that period of time?
At that period of time, if you're saying, it took it took almost a decade or two to reach where it has, and that's somewhere the political will was not there, but now it is there. How do we see that? It's somewhere. I would say that it has lots to do with China's own behavior in the region. As and when the countries felt more insecure, it felt, their security was more threatened by China's aggressive behavior, its aggressive posturing, its economic coercion towards these countries. The realization has been slow, but I think they have come to a particular understanding. And when it comes to ASEAN outlook, it was Indonesia which took the lead. It was a divided house, but somewhere they managed to bring out that document, which means that they do understand the gravity of the challenge that China poses to them. That's another matter again, that they are also kind of playing it safe. They don't want to completely, they don't want to put China, as a they don't want to get into the dynamics of containing China. They don't want to say it out loud, but they do understand, that they have to come together and deal with this challenge. So it is China's own behavior which led to this eventual realization that they need to form a strategy towards Indo-Pacific to make sure that it remains an open, free, inclusive region. So yeah.
And ma'am, do you think there was a lack of strategic foresightedness with respect to India, especially while we're talking about it, to make the right move at the right time? While we were, back then when this whole narrative was taking a pick, but it was dropped and then it came up again.
Yeah, we discussed it at length today, and with so many examples, Dr. Pant said that lack of.
But I wanted your perspective on it.
Of course, it was lack of strategic foresightedness on our part, the way we dealt, and we are still, I think, if you want to ask my perspective, I think we are still very much, softer in our approach when it comes to China. It's again the way. There is no alternative, the way Dr. Pant said. How do you deal with a country which is right at your border? You can't be, too hostile towards it. You can't be too accommodative towards it. So that's somewhere the middle path which we are struggling with. How to deal with China? It remains a challenge for our policymakers even today.
Just if I may pitch in just a second, we still don't have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and every other actor that has a stake, has an interest in Indo-Pacific, has a strategy. So I'm not sure what is it. I think 2021 they were to come up, the ministry was discussing, deliberating, but still no output whatsoever. So still waiting for one.
Yeah, so that's where the whole China question, when it comes to, it's an anti-China bloc in the Pacific strategy forward, we are not yet saying it out loud. So that only shows that, how cautious we are when it comes to our approach vis-a-vis China. Yeah. Hitesh?
Yeah, just to put a point that, the whole idea of Quad and the more close we are getting to neoliberal ideas, or the countries which follow neoliberalism, we are getting more into anti-China strategy. And that's what makes us push apart from China. Specifically, it has been you know uh, uh, somehow sabotaging our relation with Russia as well, but not really, because still we have a good relation in terms of defense deals and all. This is something what Indian strategists, the policymakers, really need to look into, because the way we are dealing with considering West as which was something not our idea when we got the whole non-alignment policies that we come across when we got independence. So we have changed our policies, but those changes are not really helping us in any way to come close to China. And yeah, maybe something has to do with ideology, maybe.
Are you talking in terms of economic gap?
I'm talking about political gap, the gap of political institutions, the ideas, the structures which are political institutions on which it works. It's very different, and this is something what really aches the United States, the empire of United States. I call it empire. so, and yeah, that and also India being a democracy. I consider it as a true democracy till now. So, yeah. So it brings instead of bringing it closer to their own uh, geopolitical countries which are sharing boundaries, it keep push us apart, because when we follow the policies which are led by West. And see, I know, like you just mentioned, that Indo-Pacific is not led by West, but the fact is, when it is led by Japan, it is led by West. And when I say West, I mean the neoliberal ideas, the ideology, which is the major factor, which we think that we have surpassed. A lot of people claim, like Slavoj Žižek say, that we are in a post-ideological world. But the fact is, I don't think so. We still have been able to come across ideologies, though we might have been able to come across it on larger scale, on global scale, because China do not work as communist when it works outside of its country, but it is certainly communist inside its country. So that's what we are having trouble with to understand. Yeah, maybe something we can ponder upon this.
So when you say it doesn't work as communist, it is actually it's just in the political setup. It works in that way. When it comes to economic policy, it is very much a liberal state. So that's where these two blocks, they do not differ. They actually align, and that's how this whole how China has created linkages with the world economy, that shows that the neoliberal policies of the government in economic sphere is very much part of that project. But yeah, we see this new thing coming up, this democracy versus non-democracies in relation to China, and this whole concert of democracy which Biden organized. And the way I mentioned, this whole Global Europe Human Rights and Democracy project, this project which over 1.5 billion euros, which they have allotted to that. Somewhere I think, this and this whole EU's idea of democracy promotion, these values and norms, it somewhere fits into this whole concept, this whole contestation between the West and China. And I believe that it is going to take, once again, it's going to take a major center stage in world politics, the idea of democracy. Here I would like to know more about your views, all of your views. What do you feel about this, this promotion of democracy, transferring democracy to other countries? West has already done that throughout Middle East and completely failed. And why are we still talking about this whole idea is something which baffles me. Yeah.
Just 1 second, Gauri, if I may just intervene before you. So I think democracy versus democracy, what you pointed out, Yatharth, that's honestly not something new, because that's the remnant of the previous century, right? We've had democracy versus communism. It's a similar thing that we see. Obviously, the actor here is different. While it was about USA versus USSR, today it's about USA versus China. But the underpinning is the same. It's capitalism versus, let's say, so-called fashion communism. But I think we are also witnessing another kind of problem, and that's democracy versus democracy, right? If you see within the European Union, now EU and the rest of the world also, we see the emergence of newer forms of democracy. Within the European Union, you have an authoritarian style democracy that's coming up in Poland, in Hungary. So today what we witness, I just want to put it a little provocatively to, participants, of course, anybody who wishes to also chip in here. What we see from my perspective, from my understanding, is that what we are witnessing today is democracy against democracy.
Yeah, so, okay, Gauri, you can go first and then I'll come back to Priya here.
Ma'am, that's all right. I'd like to listen to you first.
Okay, so when you're talking about democracy versus democracy, again, that debate is very, very problematic, because the what West has propagated, it's a very particular version of its own democracy, that liberal representative version of democracy, and everything else is you are not entered, you're not welcomed into the bloc. And so that liberal representative democracy is what we mean when we talk about democracy.
Yes, but just if I may chip in here, but the problem here is liberal democracy. Within liberal democracy, we are seeing problems.
Yeah.
It's forget about the democracy elsewhere. If you see within the union, the bloc that calls itself, the champions of liberal democracy, today we see the problems with him. Right,
the whole democracy project is somewhere. It is going through a lot.
It's stumbling. It's stumbling. The entire idea seems to be collapsing, or at least questioned.
And that background is what my question is. That when the bloc itself is going through this crisis, then what's the credibility when it comes to its democracy promotion? And that's also true that this debate is not new, but it is somewhere, the project itself, when they try to promote democracy in other countries without understanding the local context, without understanding the ground situation, the historical background, it has failed and it has backlashed so badly. The whole migrant crisis which Europe is facing from Middle East is somewhere, it's their idea of promoting democracy in that region. And my question is, why are we still discussing on that thing? Why the West is not able to understand that you can't transfer or promote democracy in other countries like that? It is not a top-down approach. It has to come up from bottom up. It starts from the grassroots itself, and the situation and the conditions needs to be created over a period of time before such a huge project can take ground. So that's what I was doing that here. Yeah, Gauri, yeah.
I have a couple of things to say. When we look at, when the world looks at China, or when we look at China as such, although it is generally seen as a communist party ruled country, it is just the political setup that we're talking about, like you mentioned earlier. And I think although a lot of people might want to differ, but this to the day probably remains about ideologies, like how China stands for certain values and how the other parts of the world stand for certain values. So, for example, if we take democracy, like you mentioned, there are different forms of democracies everywhere and different democratic values that each country stands for. So just like how there are different views on maybe say secularism, so like Western secularism is completely different from Indian secularism. So I also believe that Indian democracy has a lot of its own tenets, which probably the democracies in the West will not be able to understand, or they do not have it in them. So, and I also believe that, like a ma'am said, it cannot be a top-down approach, also because there has to be something called as a prism of cultural differences through which we have to pass certain concepts when we have to adopt them to our country, and without which, if we try to kind of impose them, it is not going to work out well. And also, when we're talking about authoritative kind of regimes in democracy, it feels like, although it is a threat to kind of, the way people can express themselves or whatever, but then it is still to be acknowledged as the countries are still to be acknowledged as democracies, because at the end of the day, they're still following the same electoral method, where after every set period of time, there is going to be an election, and then people still go cast their votes. And at any point of time, if a section of that country feels that this particular government is not, or party is not serving the purpose of growth, or the larger purpose of welfare of people, then they're going to be out of power anyway. So when we see democracies with authoritative kind of regime, then we should probably separate it from the kind of political situation that is there in China. That is what I want to say.
This is a very last line, and the word you use, democracy with authoritative kind of regimes, that itself is very difficult to understand. How can a country be democracy with authoritative kind of regime?
So yeah, this is the narrative that usually people put across, and then this is also spoken about India very frequently these days, wherein it is believed that the decision-making power lies with one person, and that person seems to be authoritative or imposing kind of a regime is sort of perceived, and then people consider that the government is not accommodative of the views of people or larger public as such. So they kind of tend to term those regimes as authoritative in nature, but I don't really kind of understand the paradox here anyway. Yeah.
All right, Bon, the question here remains that, if the West itself is going through democratic crisis, let's say the EU itself, can we apply this whole European model of regional integration and their values and norms to, a region as fragmented as South Asia? Is it even viable?
Ma'am, is that question to me?
All of you.
Okay.
I think we have already done that. Integrated as when we integrated India. We have already been able to do that successfully, that we integrated very different identities all together in one union and make it
regional approach. I'm talking about the model of regional integration, not national integration.
Yeah.
So I'm saying,
ma'am, if I may.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I think we have already started taking baby steps forward in that direction, and I think the best way, well, the best example would be ASEAN itself. But I think we haven't really moved forward in the direction of, let's say, having free movement, or a region without boundaries per se, or maybe some other nuances when we talk about it from the EU perspective. Obviously, there are some issues which the nation states will have to come together. I think, for me personally, when I look back at the EU itself, the establishment of EU, the EU was formed with a larger role or a larger purpose to avoid future conflicts, to avoid the possibility of a third war emerging in the Europe itself. And I think if issues pop up in Asia, which the countries, I think it all comes down to self-realization, actually, that if, let's say, for example, if ASEAN nations believe that, okay, now is the time where we decide to abolish our borders, we allow for easy movement and free movement of trade, goods, services, technology, etc. We look forward to better connectivity, better opportunities for our own people, and maybe a land where we allow for all languages, all cultures, because again, the Southeast Asia as a region, we have got a lot of religions. We have got Muslim, Islam, we have got Hinduism, we have got Christianity as well. So I think if we start from ASEAN, and if ASEAN goes on to become the next EU, at least structurally, if not by principle, then I think it starts to serve as a a guiding block, or a guide essentially for other possible regions. Now we have got the Central Asia, for example, the Central Asian nations like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and the other nations who also have got their own fair share of issues, which have to do more with domestic issues rather than international issues as such. But still there are commonalities that exist between them, like for example having a Soviet origin, Soviet era origin. So I think it all comes down to firstly realizing a bigger threat which could take place in the future, the possibility of a threat rather, and second, the self-conscious, or the self-realization that yes, an integrated, a better, united region or association would be the way forward. I think that's how I personally look at it.
Okay, thank you, Anand. Actually, okay, Shubhankar has something to say. I'll come to that. But what I was asking is not Southeast Asia. ASEAN is already a different ball game. I was asking about a more complicated, a more complex region like South Asia, which is not able to somewhere move beyond the rivalry of India and Pakistan, even when there is a bigger threat and a bigger power which is taking up lot of space within the region, that is China. And when I talk about the European model of integration, even when you apply it to Southeast Asia, or let's say when we discuss it in with regard to South Asia, also we kind of forget that these countries and both these regions comes with a historical colonial legacy, and that's where the idea of sovereignty itself becomes very important for these countries. And the way I would say it's still a project in progress, and they already have a lot of crisis, but the way they were able to somewhere let go of that sovereignty and put it in Brussels, it would be a very difficult task for the countries in this region, with a colonial background, the colonial history. So the idea of sovereignty is very important, and their national interests won't allow them to take up a project like that ever. It's one thing, and secondly, when EU itself is in crisis, why would they want to move ahead in that direction? Now there is the whole idea of sovereignty has come back to haunt us once again, and somewhere these countries can look at EU and have that the thing that we told you so, you are way ahead of your time. So that's how at least I perceive this whole idea, that it's the distinctive vulnerabilities which these states have, their colonial legacy, and the whole idea of sovereignty, why it is important for these countries. So it becomes a very difficult task for them to transfer a part of it into a supranational body which EU states were able to create. Gauri, Hitesh, and Shubhankar, maybe?
Yeah, ma'am. Actually, so I wrote the same thing, that like in terms of regional integration, we do see some baby steps between India and Bangladesh. But again, that is because Bangladesh is completely surrounded by India. So it's probably more of a strategic choice, and not entirely driven by the idea of regionally integrating itself in the area. And also, I since we were discussing about democracies in our regions, of course, we have the historical baggage with us, which becomes a very determining factor. But for example, what I see here in the West when I'm trying to describe India, when I say that it has these 30 different provinces and each of them is like its own country in itself, and then contrary to what we have learned in India, that our diversity is our strength, when I'm explaining to that here in the West, it often comes across as a problem, because the standard response I get is, oh my God, that's too complicated. I don't want to understand that. Like, why did you even decide to be one country then? Like, if it's so different across regions. And then, I don't know. So then the common standard discussion it tends to become that take the shape that maybe we should have a more devolved and more decentralized power, and just so that these identities which still exist under the national identity can get their own voice. And also just one more point would be I feel that India is an oligocracy, because it has a democracy, but it doesn't work for everybody. I feel like there are certain sections which exploit it more than the rest. So what I feel is there are certain inherent values from the Western democracy which, unless we completely establish, we can't even debate this. For example, accountability or very strong institutions. I feel that is still missing in the Indian democracy. Our institutions are weak and not independent, and also very less accountable. And I think that itself destroys the ground for a discussion like on the fact that can we actually democratically progress, because are we even democratic in the first place? So yeah, that's my point.
Thank you so much, Shubhankar. It's a very interesting insight you're providing here. I'm surprised with the kind of reaction you're getting over here when it comes to India and its size and the complexity. Somewhere that points out that how less we still understand each other. EU and India or EU and Asian countries, there is still a lot of scope to know more about the other, despite whatever the momentum, the relationships between these two regions, these two countries, these two blocks have picked up. There is still a lack of understanding. If your explanation has come as a surprise at how diverse, how multicultural India is. Also, your point on democracy, when you say that India is an oligarchy and not yet completely a democracy, I think that we need to understand that democracy itself it's always a project in progress, and there is no a final end result of democracy. We are always moving towards, always finding better ways to enhance it. Also, there is no a linear progression. There will always be some progress and some setbacks. That's the way it moves, and that's somewhere West also needs to understand that there is no linear progression when it comes to democracy. So there will be some progress, there will be some setbacks, and we need to take into account. We can't create very clear black and white blocks here, that democracy and non-democracy and this and that. I think that it's especially in developing world, especially if I may say in the third world, the conditions where it's are still not suitable. It will always be a project in progress. I think Rishabh. Hitesh, I think you got quite so I'll go to Rishabh. Rishabh?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I just wanted to actually know that since the EU doesn't really have a defined strategy in the Indo-Pacific, which side is it supposed to actually take? Or will it actually just be actually swinging like a pendulum to Chinese or the US side as per its own interest suited?
US does have a strategy, Rishabh. It has a very clear document in the Pacific strategy, and somewhere what we discussed today also, and I think Priya in previous session also kind of tried to tell you that it is somewhere closer to ASEAN in that regard. And what Dr. Wacker also said today, that it doesn't see the whole Indo-Pacific idea from the prism of containing China. When it comes to its China's policy, it is. I feel that it is still kind of it's balancing out. It calls it systemic rival, but there are certain areas like climate change where it understands how important it is to work with China, and there is no progress possible. So it will deal with it. It will engage with it wherever in areas it is necessary. And when it comes to give a pushback on certain fields, then it calls it a systemic rival. So it is ready to collaborate with other like-minded countries in that regard. I think one last question and then we stop here. Maybe Veronica.
Right, thank you. I would like to two things I would like to respond to. First is the EU's normative power. That happened to be a paper that I presented last week for my master's studies. Yes, I agree that it is in the center of the EU or most Europeans of human rights, of good public governance. And for me, I was a trade advisor for an European Ministry of Foreign Affairs attached to an embassy in my own country, Malaysia. So I actually accompanied the ambassador to visit some NGOs and also some groups that from that I could see that EU has the intention of supporting the vulnerable groups. For example, women, and then also women and children who are abused, and also support the also oppositions politicians that they see perhaps has the potential of growth. And for me as a Malaysian who actually sort of like struggle with internal politics in Malaysia, I do appreciate what the EU has done. And that's also coming to another part for China. I actually think that there are rooms for collaboration in between India and China. And for me, I actually, because my master study is about China green energy policy, I see that is also what lacking in India, which is a clear policy direction to move the whole nation. And then coming to EU in Southeast Asia, I would say that even European products cannot compete with Chinese products. It's simply that Chinese products are so cheap. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your insights with us. I wish you had raised a question today when Dr. Pant and Dr. Wacker were here. But maybe next time. With this, I'm afraid we have to close today's session. Hitesh, your hand is still raised. Maybe tomorrow we will take it up, whatever you have to say. Thank you so much for joining us on this second day. It was a pleasure connecting and communicating with you, engaging with you. It's such an enthusiastic bunch we have got for our winter school. We are extremely happy the way you are engaging with our resource person with us. Please keep up the enthusiasm on day 3 and till day 6. We would love to hear more from you. All right, I'll see you tomorrow then. Thank you so much.